Hello, so we're going to have a look at the exam question focusing around a maximum price. So the exam question is: evaluate using a relevant diagram the impact of a price ceiling being applied to housing rent. And the question is a 12-mark answer. So just to go through the marks associated with a 12-mark question. You've got 1 mark for knowledge, there's 1 mark available for application, there are 5 marks available for analysis, and 5 marks available for evaluation. And basically how this type of response should be answered is you should, as we always do, we start off with our definition. So define key terms. We explain how the intervention would work. We would evaluate the intervention, and we give a little judgment. So really, a 12-mark response is just a development of an 8-mark response, just looking for a little bit more analysis and a little bit more evaluation. So there's nothing specifically new with regards to answering a 12-mark question. We're just looking for greater depth to our analysis and our evaluation. And obviously, it's going to be easier to gain those analysis and evaluation because obviously we're using new diagrams which are a little bit more technical, and there's a few more extra things that we can talk about. So let's start by looking to answer this question. So obviously when we're talking about a price ceiling, we're talking about a maximum price, because obviously a price ceiling, you can't go above that price. That price ceiling is the maximum price, and you can't go above it. So key way to start the answer: define max price. Obviously explaining that a maximum price is a price ceiling above which producers are not allowed to sell for. Okay, now we need to make it applicable to the case study. So the case study was specifically focusing on rent controls, and what it suggested the UK might wish to do is it might wish that local authorities would decrease rent levels of the current market to be comparable to social housing. So just for those who may not understand the language that we're using here, when we talk about local authorities, we're talking about local councils. So people in charge of certain areas are going to be determining what the maximum price should be. And what it suggests is that these local councils, local authorities, should decrease the rent levels of the current market to be comparable with social housing. And what we mean by social housing is housing that is supported by the local authority. So people who may not necessarily have the financial capability to buy a house, or for other reasons may not be able to afford expensive rent, social housing is a way of giving them access to a house. So decreasing the level of rent in a market to the rent for social housing should therefore make housing more accessible to people. So we've got some application there with regards to the case study. We've defined what a maximum price is. So we've already demonstrated some knowledge and application at the start of our response. Now what we want to do is we want to make sure we can get our analysis. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to draw our maximum price diagram, because as it says in the question, using a relevant diagram. So let's insert our diagram here. Price quantity, demand curve, supply curve. We'll put in our original market equilibrium, label that PQ. We'll remember to put our maximum price below the market equilibrium. P max, maximum price, and we'll make sure to add in our additional quantities, and we'll label that area between Q1 and Q2 as excess demand. So as you can see, we've drawn our maximum price diagram very well indeed. And again, that shows relevant application. Obviously, we've put the relevant diagram to the question. So we've applied our understanding of economics very well here. So now all we need to do is we need to explain how the maximum price, the price ceiling, using the diagram would impact on the market for housing rent. So we'll explain that maximum price set below market equilibrium. And obviously the market equilibrium was PQ. So the original market equilibrium was PQ. So the maximum price is set below the market equilibrium. What does this mean? Well, maximum price set below the market equilibrium at P max. Okay, what does that mean? As I said a moment ago, it means that there's an extension along the demand curve, leading to an increase in quantity demanded from Q to Q2. Okay. So the extension on the demand curve, increased quantity demanded, Q to Q2. We see that there. We would have gone down here, the extension along the demand curve. Okay. And the reason for that is because the price has decreased from P to P max. Obviously meaning consumers are more willing and able to rent at the given time and price. Okay, so it's really important that we use that technical language to demonstrate a thorough economic understanding. So just to recap, the maximum price is set below the market equilibrium. The market equilibrium was PQ, and the max price is set at P max. That's demonstrated by our diagram. We must refer back to our diagram. This price of P max means there's an extension along the demand curve with an increased quantity demanded from Q to Q2. The reason for that, the increase in quantity demanded from Q to Q2, as mentioned before with regards to the maximum price, obviously the price has fallen from P to P max, and meaning that consumers are more willing and able to rent at the given time and price. Okay, so let's just make sure we answer the question here. As a result, there should be greater access to housing, and what that should do is that should prevent inequality and also prevent homelessness as well. So giving greater access to housing should prevent inequality and also prevent homelessness. Okay. However, what we also see is the decrease in price from P to P max leads to a contraction along the supply curve, with a decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1, because suppliers, and in this case the suppliers would be landlords, would be less willing and able to let their properties. So when you talk about the rental market, landlords let their properties out. They let their properties out to tenants. So the suppliers, i.e. the landlords, will be less willing and able to let their properties out at the given time and price. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, this means that the quantity demanded, which is Q2, is far greater than the quantity supplied, which is Q1, and as a result, this leads to excess demand. And excess demand would be Q2 minus Q1, and that would give you the amount of excess demand that there would be. Okay, so what we need to make sure we mention in our response is obviously all that I've just gone through there. That clearly explains how a maximum price works and the impact of the maximum price being applied to housing rent. So just to recap, the maximum price is set below the market equilibrium. The market equilibrium is obviously PQ, and the maximum price is set at P max. The extension along the demand curve increases quantity demanded from Q to Q2 because of the decrease in price from P to P max, obviously meaning consumers are more willing and able to rent at the given time and price. As a result, there's greater access to housing, preventing inequality and homelessness, hopefully. And the decrease in price from P to P max does, however, cause a contraction on the supply curve with a decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1. Suppliers, in this case landlords, would be less willing and able to let their properties out at the given time and price. This results in excess demand because obviously the quantity demanded is Q2 is greater than the quantity supplied, which is Q1, and therefore we have excess demand of Q2 to Q1. Okay, what we now need to do is we need to make sure we evaluate our response and talk about how effective our maximum price is going to be and whether it's actually going to prevent inequality and prevent homelessness, as we talked about previously in our response. Okay, so what's going to happen due to the decrease in price P to P max? What do we see? Well, it even gave us a hint in the case study. It said there would be a decreased supply of rental properties. Why would there be a decreased supply in rental properties? Well, buy-to-let landlords sell their properties. Okay, so let's just understand what the case study was saying when it says rental property, buy-to-let landlords sell their properties. So some people buy properties in order to let them out, in order for people to rent them. Okay, and people generate an income by buying the property and then letting them out, and therefore if they're the landlord's letting them out, someone's paying rent in order to stay in that property. Okay, but obviously if landlords who bought the property in order to rent that property out are now receiving a lower rent because of the maximum price, there may be an incentive therefore to actually sell the property and generate more income by selling the property rather than renting it out. Okay, and the decrease in the supply, obviously from Q to Q1, because that's the decrease in the quantity supplied, obviously means there's fewer houses and therefore no access. And actually, that's not going to solve the issue of inequality and homelessness. Yes, it will make it more affordable. However, it doesn't actually tackle the problem. because actually landlords are just going to sell their property. Okay. Another point you may wish to talk about with regards to the impact the quality of the housing may suffer. And why may that be? Well, landlords obviously now are receiving a lower price, rental price. Therefore, they're not going to do the quality, the home up to a gooder standard. So landlords look to reduce costs, so reduce quality in order to maintain a profit. And then the really important evaluative point that we want to be mentioning is we want to be mentioning about the price elasticity of supply. Okay, and what we want to be using is we want to be using relevant diagrams to support it. And obviously this is a 12-mark response, so we should be making sure that we use diagrams which are fully explained to support our evaluation. So P, Q. Let's make this supply curve inelastic. That's demand. Then we'll introduce our maximum price. So we've got P, Q, Q1, Q2, P max, max price. Okay, so we've drawn our diagram here. Obviously, the price elasticity of supply here is inelastic because we obviously have a very steep supply curve. So what we see here with the decrease in price from P to P max, we see a less than proportional decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1. So obviously that's far more important and beneficial because obviously it ensures that people will still have access. Obviously some people aren't going to be able to have access because yes, there is a decrease in quantity supplied, but the decrease in quantity supplied is less than proportional. Whereas if the price elasticity of supply was elastic, we see a very different story. So P, Q, we'll draw a nice elastic supply curve this time. Supply, demand, we'll introduce our maximum price here. We'll draw our original market equilibrium. So we've got original market equilibrium of PQ. We've got P max there. We've got max price there. And then we'll add in our quantities. We've got Q1, Q2. So obviously the price elasticity of supply, as I mentioned, is price elasticity of supply is elastic because as we can see, we've got quite a shallow supply curve here. So the decrease in price from P to P max leads to a more than proportional decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1. Okay, and it's really important we use that terminology, more than proportional decrease in quantity supplied, and we reference our diagram because that ensures that we get the top evaluation marks possible because we're using a diagram effectively to support our explanation. Okay, so we've talked about the price elasticity of supply there. So let's just flip over onto the back and explain why the price elasticity of supply is important. So we've shown the theory. We now just need to explain why that is important with regards to the impact upon the housing rental market. So better for those wishing to rent if the price elasticity of supply is inelastic due to lower decrease in quantity supplied. Okay, so there's more. So with the price elasticity of supply being inelastic, we'd like to think that therefore there would be more housing available. Yes, there's going to be a reduction in the amount of rental properties, but the reduction is less than proportional considering the price. Okay, that's a really important point to make. And then finally, we're going to include a judgment in our response. This is really important that we have a judgment, because you can't access all of the evaluation marks if you don't have a judgment that has relevant evaluation that hasn't already been mentioned. So what you should be doing throughout your response is you should be saving a piece of evaluation that you haven't used in the body of your answer to include in the judgment to ensure that you get the full evaluation marks. Because let me reiterate, you cannot get all the evaluation marks, and therefore you cannot get full marks for a particular question if you do not have a judgment which has a relevant piece of evaluation in it. That applies for all the essay responses in economics. You must have a bit of evaluation in your judgment which is brand new. Otherwise, you cannot gain full evaluation marks, and therefore you are limiting your the number of marks that you can get for your response. So that's key, that we have a bit of evaluation that's new that we can include in our judgment. Okay, so as we've talked about many a time, the judgment should be quite simple, but then should just have that bit of evaluation that I was talking about moments ago. So basically, we've got the maximum price. Is it going to have a positive or negative impact? Okay, and you can decide. There's no right or wrong answer here, and then you just need to explain why. So I'm going to say that the maximum price, or the price ceiling as the question states, the price ceiling should have a positive impact upon the housing rental market, because so I've answered the question. It should have a positive impact, and now I'm going to explain why. It should have a positive impact because the reduction in price, so I'll just highlight what my answer was. So it's a positive. Why? The decrease in price from P to P max should ensure an increased quantity demanded. Okay, and we can reference our diagram Q2. Let me just refer back to the diagram so make sure I get this right. Q to Q2. And if we wanted to include other elements of what we've learnt about with regards to maximum pricing, we may also wish to talk about there would be an increase in consumer surplus. That's something else that we could have added to our response. Obviously, we learned about how maximum price impacts upon producer and consumer surplus. So increased consumer surplus as well, something else that would add to a strength of our response. We could have mentioned that earlier on, actually, if we wished to, but I've added it in here, and it just gives a little bit more strength to our argument of why I think the maximum price, or the price ceiling, has a positive impact. Okay, and therefore I'm just going to make sure greater access to housing. And then finally, depends on. And this is where, again, as I mentioned before, it's really important that we have evaluation. The positive impact is going to depend on where the max price is set. Okay, the lower the max price, the greater increase in quantity demanded, and therefore there should be greater access to housing. So obviously it's really important about where the maximum price is set. The lower the maximum price, so the greater the maximum price is away from the free market equilibrium, the greater the increase in quantity demanded, and therefore there should hopefully therefore be greater access to housing, and therefore greater reductions in inequality and homelessness. But as we do know, obviously, the lower the maximum price, the greater the excess demand. Okay, so we've recognised that actually there are issues with that, but we would like to see a lower maximum price in order to generate a greater increase in quantity demanded, and obviously therefore providing greater access to housing that would lead to a greater reduction in inequality and homelessness. And we just compare it to when the maximum price is not set so low, is quite high. The higher the max price, the smaller the increase in QD, and therefore less access to housing. Okay, so there we go. We've gone through a 12-mark response in detail, focusing particularly on well-developed evaluation. So just to recap, 12-mark responses should ensure that we have relevant knowledge and application, and the only differences between an 8 and a 12-mark response is that we're looking for greater depth of analysis and evaluation. Okay, so we started our answer with the definition of a maximum price. We included some relevant application to the case study, not only here when we talked about local authorities decreasing rent levels of current market to be comparable with social housing. We also included it here because it did mention in the case study that the supply of rental properties may decrease with buy-to-let landlords selling their properties. Okay, we included a relevant diagram because the question asked us to use a relevant diagram. So we included the maximum price diagram. We explained how a maximum price would impact upon the housing rental market, with obviously the decrease in price causing an increase in quantity demanded, and therefore meaning hopefully people had greater access to housing, and obviously that greater access to housing would reduce homelessness and potentially reduce inequality as well. But we did obviously recognise the issues with regards to excess demand, with obviously landlords not wishing to rent their properties out anymore and actually maybe selling their properties because obviously the decrease in rent that they would get. We recognise that the quality of housing may suffer as well because obviously landlords are looking to maintain a profit and therefore look to reduce their costs, so quality therefore may fall. Really key bit of evaluation when we're talking about maximum prices, we must consider the price elasticity of supply, and we said we must include relevant diagrams and use the technical terminology. So if the price elasticity of supply is inelastic, a decrease in price from P to P max would lead to a less than proportional decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1. Really important that we reference back to our diagram. And we also said that if the price elasticity of supply was elastic, a decrease in price from P to P max would lead to a more than proportional decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1. So we've used technical language there, we've used a relevant diagram, and we've referenced our diagram as well. And then we've just put a summary statement with regards to that. Better for those wishing to rent if price elasticity of supply is inelastic due to a lower decrease in quantity supplied. And then we finally said that obviously a judgment is essential in order for us to gain access to the very highest mark in our essay based questions, and we must have a bit of evaluation in there that has yet to be seen in our response. So we argued that the maximum price would be positive because the decrease in the price from P to P max should increase quantity demanded from Q to Q2, again referencing in our diagram, and that should increase the consumer surplus, a point we hadn't previously mentioned, and actually in retrospect we should have probably mentioned that a little bit earlier on with regards to consumer surplus increasing due to the reduction in price. There is a greater access to housing, hopefully, therefore. However, the maximum price is very much dependent on where it is set. Obviously, the lower the maximum price, the greater the increase in quantity demanded, and therefore hopefully we'd see a greater access to housing and a greater decrease in inequality and homelessness, but it does generate greater excess demand. And then finally, the higher the maximum price, the smaller the increase in quantity demanded, and therefore less access to housing. I'm just going to change the word access, because access refers to kind of supply, doesn't it? So let's just revisit. Where the maximum price is set lower, the maximum price, we would see a greater increase in quantity demanded, greater number of people in housing, we'll put, and we'll also just put higher maximum price, the smaller the increase, and therefore less people in housing. Obviously, another evaluative point that you may have wished to mention, just going off the back of obviously talking about the consumer surplus, obviously a maximum price does generate a welfare loss as well. And you may wish to have included a diagram to demonstrate that point, but that was an additional evaluative point that you may wish to have mentioned, that obviously a maximum price generates a welfare loss. You could have shown that on a diagram if you wish to, but obviously that's another limitation of a maximum price. So key things to remember: focus on the detail of your analysis and evaluation, and make sure you have relevant evaluation in your judgment.